It started, as these things often do, with a simple, almost noble ambition. My name is Leo, and I'm a wildlife photographer. Not the kind that sits in a comfortable blind waiting for deer to wander by, but the kind that chases ghosts, rumors of elusive creatures in places most people have forgotten exist. My target this time was the white-tailed ptermigan, a bird so skilled at camouflage it's practically a myth. The only whispers of a consistent nesting ground were in the high-altitude wilderness of Colorado, near a defunct silver mining town called Whispering Creek. The name should have been my first clue. Whispering Creek wasn't on any modern maps. I found it through a series of faded survey charts from the 1890s. Getting there involved a punishing drive up a gravel road that my Jeep barely tolerated, followed by a long hike. The town itself was a collection of skeletal cabins slowly being swallowed by the aspen and pine. The silence was profound, heavy. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, it was the hollow silence of abandonment. The only sound was the wind, moaning through the broken window panes of the old saloon like a forgotten drunk. I spent the first day setting up my base camp in the least rotten-looking cabin and scouting the area. To keep the oppressive silence at bay, I took to whistling, a little meandering tune I'd made up years ago. It was my subconscious soundtrack, something I did without thinking. I'd whistle it in the shower, in traffic, and now in the heart of a ghost town at 10,000 feet. On the morning of the second day, I was hiking a ridge overlooking the valley. The air was crisp, the light was perfect. I paused for a drink of water, the world silent save for my own breathing. And then I heard it. Faint, carried on the breeze, was a whistle, a thin melodic sound that cut through the stillness. I smiled, thinking another hiker or a park ranger was in the area. It was oddly comforting. But as I listened, a cold knot began to form in my stomach. It wasn't just any whistle. It was my whistle, the same rambling, aimless tune, note for perfect note. I stood up, cupping my mouth around me. "Hello?" I shouted. "Anyone out there?" My voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. No reply. Only the wind. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the acoustics, a bizarre echo bouncing off the jagged peaks. But the tune had been too perfect, too sustained. I continued my hike, but the joy was gone, replaced by a low-level anxiety. The trails around Whispering Creek were practically non-existent, choked with a decade of untamed growth. There were no fresh footprints, no broken branches, no signs of human passage other than my own. The idea of another person being out here, shadowing me, was somehow more unsettling than being alone. Later that afternoon, drawn by a strange formation of rocks, I ventured off the main path into a dense grove of ancient, gnarled bristlecone pines. The air grew still and cold. The light of the sun seemed to struggle to pierce the canopy. It was in the center of this grove that I found it. It was a structure, for lack of a better word, woven from dead branches, twisted roots, and bleached animal bones. It was shaped like a massive hollowed-out den or a nest, but it wasn't built by any animal I could name. The construction was too deliberate, the weaving too intricate, almost artistic. It felt less like a shelter and more like a shrine, built for something that didn't belong in our world. A wave of primal fear washed over me, the kind your ancestors felt when they saw eyes glowing just beyond the firelight. I slowly backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to leave, not just the grove, but the entire mountain. And that's when I heard the whistle again. This time, it wasn't an echo. It wasn't on the wind. It was a reply, and it was right behind my ear. Time seemed to freeze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was locked in place. My blood ran cold, and a hair on my arm stood straight up. Slowly, as if moving through water, I forced myself to turn. Standing not 20 feet away, partially obscured by the trunk of a pine, was a bighorn sheep. But to call it that feels like an understatement. It was a monarch, an absolute titan of its species, with a thick, battle-scarred coat and massive, curling horns that seemed to hold the weight of the mountain itself. It was perfectly still, like a statue, and its eyes were not the flat, passive eyes of a prey animal. They were a pair of ancient, intelligent, and unnervingly yellow orbs that were fixed directly on me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The forest was dead silent. Not a bird chirped, not a squirrel chattered. It was as if all of life was holding its breath, waiting. Then the creature moved. It wasn't a sudden charge or a skittish retreat. It slowly, deliberately opened its mouth. And it opened it too far. The jaw unhinged in a way a mammal's jaw isn't meant to bend, revealing a dark, cavernous throat. From that unnatural chasm, the sound emerged. It was my tune. Perfect, flute-like, and impossibly human, the melody I had been whistling all morning poured out of the creature's throat. It was a flawless, pristine imitation, stripped of any breath or tremor. It was the sound of a recording played through a living, breathing monster. The camera slipped from my numb fingers and hit the pine needles with a soft thud. The spell was broken. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat. I just turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning in the thin air, and the whistling followed me. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees to my left, the rocks to my right, the air above me. It was no longer a single source, but an omnipotent chorus, a symphony of my own little tune, played by the mountain itself. I scrambled back onto the main trail, my boots slipping on loose scree, and sprinted toward the ghost town, toward my jeep, my only link to civilization. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, dogging my every step. As I burst through the trees and saw the rusted roof of my cabin, the sound began to change. The clear, melodic notes started to warp, to bend and distort. The pitch slid downwards, becoming guttural, wet. The cheerful whistle began to bubble and stretch, transforming into something else, something horribly familiar. It became a laugh, a wheezing, rattling cackle, punctuated by a sharp, phlegmy gasp for air. I stumbled to a halt, my body refusing to move. I knew that laugh. It was the laugh of my late grandfather, a hard, often cruel man whose mockery had haunted my childhood. The sound echoed through the silent town, a personal, tailor-made horror broadcast from the throat of an impossible entity. Panic gave me a final burst of adrenaline. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to get the Jeep door open. I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and cranked the engine. As I tore down the gravel road, fishtailing wildly, the whistling followed me, finally fading as I hit the main highway. But it didn't really go away. Even now, weeks later, in the sterile safety of my apartment 1,000 miles away, I sometimes hear it. When the house is quiet, when I'm about to fall asleep, a faint whistling melody will start up in the back of my mind, and I have to turn on every light, blast the TV, do anything to drown it out before it has a chance to turn into that laugh. It wasn't just a memory. It was an echo lodged in the hollow space of my soul. And I know, with a certainty that freezes my blood, that I didn't leave it on the mountain. I brought it home with me. We bought the farm as an escape. That's what we told ourselves anyway. My wife, Sarah, and I were tired of the city, the noise, the rent, the feeling of being 2 hamsters on a wheel that was slowly catching fire. The property was a listing no one else wanted, 100 acres of rugged Oregon forest with a small, sturdy farmhouse and a barn that had seen better days. It was remote, isolated, and to us, it was paradise. The first few weeks were a blur of idyllic hard work. We fixed fences, planted a garden, and bought a small herd of cattle, their gentle presence turning the wild land into a home. The silence was the best part. At night, it was so absolute you could hear your own blood pumping in your ears. At least, it was for a while. The first sign that something was wrong came from the cattle. I'd find them in the morning, not scattered across the pasture, but huddled in a tight, trembling bunch against the fence closest to the house. Their eyes would be wide with a kind of primal terror, their bodies slick with sweat despite the cool night air. They looked like they'd spent the entire night running from a predator, but the fences were intact. There were no tracks, no signs of a wolf or a cougar. They were just scared of the dark. One night, a motion sensor light I'd installed on the barn flicked on, flooding the pasture in a harsh white glare. I went to the window, expecting to see a deer or a raccoon. Instead, standing just at the edge of the woods where the pasture met the black wall of pine trees, was a moose. It was the biggest I'd ever seen, a dark mountain of muscle and fur. Its antlers were a sprawling, jagged crown. But it wasn't its size that was unsettling. It was its stillness. It wasn't eating, it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, its massive head turned towards our house, watching. I watched it for nearly an hour before going back to bed, and it didn't so much as flick an ear. The next morning, it was gone. This became a nightly ritual. The cattle would panic, the light would come on, and the moose would be there, a silent, unmoving sentinel at the tree line. I started calling it the Night Shepherd, a morbid little joke to myself as I watched it seemingly herd the terrified cattle with its mere presence. I told myself it was just a quirk of nature, a territorial bull. I was an expert at lying to myself. The real terror began on a moonless Tuesday. I was woken from a deep sleep by Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Mark," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Listen." I sat up, my ears straining against the silence. And then I heard it, a low, dry, scraping sound. It was rhythmic, steady. Scrape, drag, scrape, drag. It sounded like someone was slowly pulling a long, heavy branch along the wooden siding of our house. It was coming from outside, moving along the wall right below our bedroom window. It continued, following the perimeter of the house. We listened, frozen in our bed, as the sound moved past the front door, along the far wall of the living room, around the back by the kitchen, and then started its journey again. It was making a slow, deliberate circle around our home. "Call the police," Sarah breathed, her fingers digging into my arm. "And tell them what?" I whispered back. "Someone scratching our house with a stick?" The sound was maddening, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. It wasn't a break-in, it was a siege. After 10 minutes that felt like 10 years, a cold rage burned through my fear. This was my home, my sanctuary, and something was out there circling it like a shark. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The scraping stopped, as if it heard me. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I crept to the gun cabinet, my heart hammering. I pulled out my 12-gauge shotgun, the familiar weight a small comfort in my trembling hands. "Mark, no," Sarah pleaded from the doorway. "Don't go out there." "I'm just going to look," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I chambered around, the shuck-shuck of the pump action echoing in the silent house. "Lock the door behind me." I stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. The world was utterly black, save for the weak yellow light spilling from the doorway behind me. A click confirmed Sarah had locked the deadbolt. I was alone out here. I took a deep breath, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs, and flicked on the powerful flashlight mounted to the barrel of my shotgun. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the darkness. I swept it along the side of the house. There was nothing there. No footprints in the soft dirt beside the foundation, no broken branches, no sign of what had made the sound. I walked the full perimeter of the house, shotgun held at the ready, my senses screaming. Nothing. It was as if the sound had been a shared hallucination. But I knew it wasn't. The fear from the cattle, the sentinel moose, the scraping, they were all connected. The answer was in the trees. Against my better judgment, I turned from the relative safety of the house and pointed my light toward the tree line. The beam landed on him immediately, as if he'd been waiting for it. The moose. He was closer now, standing just a few yards inside the forest, his massive form partially obscured by the trunks of the pines. He wasn't moving, just watching. "Get out of here!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Go on, get!" The moose didn't react. It just stood there, a statue carved from shadow and malice. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my anger making me reckless. I needed to see it, to understand what I was up against. As I got closer, the beam of my flashlight slid up from its chest and settled on its head, and my world fell apart. It was the eyes. The flashlight illuminated them perfectly. They weren't the dark, glossy, solid black eyes of a moose. The whites of its eyes, the sclera, were enormous, a stark, milky white canvas against its dark fur, and in the center of each was a small, perfectly round, dark pupil, like a pinprick. They were human eyes. A wave of nausea and dizzying vertigo washed over me. I stumbled backward, my finger tightening on the trigger. My mind was a frantic cacophony of 1,000 rejected thoughts. This wasn't possible. It was a trick of the light, a deformity, anything but what it so clearly was. And then it began to move. But it didn't charge, and it didn't retreat. Slowly, with a sound like ancient trees groaning under a heavy load, it began to rise. Its front legs buckled in a way that looked agonizing, shifting its enormous weight. Its shoulders heaved, and its spine elongated. It was getting up. It was standing up on its hind legs. I was paralyzed, a fly in amber, watching this abomination of nature defy every law I knew. The creature straightened to its full, impossible height, towering over me, a dark silhouette against the stars, its human eyes glowing faintly in the reflected light from my flashlight. And in that moment of absolute, soul-shattering terror, a new sound began. Scrap, drag, scrap, drag. It wasn't coming from the monster in front of me. My blood ran cold. The sound was coming from behind me, from inside my house, from upstairs, right outside our bedroom door.
There's a hole in my memory of childhood. It's not a big one. It's a small, jagged tear around a single afternoon when I was 8 years old. For years, my family told me I just got scared playing a game in the woods, a simple case of an overactive imagination. But an imagination doesn't leave you with a lifelong aversion to the sound of rustling leaves or the sight of a forest at dusk. An imagination doesn't haunt the edges of your dreams for 2 decades. It was our annual family camping trip to Pine Ridge National Park. My dad, ever the showman, had a tradition, the hunt for the forest spirit. It was our version of a snipe hunt, a goofy prank for the kids. He'd tell us about a shy, magical creature that only appeared when a family was truly happy, and that if we were quiet and hid well enough, we might catch a glimpse. It was, of course, just a game to keep us occupied while the adults set up the barbecue. That day, I was determined to win. I was going to be the quietest. I was going to hide the best. While my older sister, Chloe, ducked behind a predictable-looking oak tree near the picnic blanket, I took my mission seriously. I told my mom I was going to find a real hiding spot and plunged into the woods. The forest at Pine Ridge is ancient and deep. The sunlight, bright and cheerful in our little clearing, quickly became dappled and weak under the dense canopy of pines. The happy shouts of my family faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the crunch of pine needles under my sneakers. I went deeper than I ever had before, a delicious thrill of rebellion mixing with the game. I finally found the perfect spot, a hollow in the earth where a great tree had been uprooted long ago, its tangled roots forming a cave-like enclosure masked by a thick curtain of ferns. I crawled inside, the air immediately turning cool and smelling of damp soil and decay. I was completely invisible. I grinned to myself, picturing my dad's impressed face when he finally found me. I sat there, listening, waiting. The silence stretched. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of the woods, but a heavy, watchful silence, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. A twig snapped nearby. I held my breath, thinking my dad had found me already, but the sound wasn't followed by his cheerful gotcha. Slowly, something shambled into my line of sight through the ferns. My first thought was that it was a sick deer. It was gaunt, impossibly so, its gray, leathery skin pulled tight over a rack of protruding ribs. It moved on 4 legs, but they were too long, jointed at angles that felt fundamentally wrong, like a spider's. Patches of coarse black fur clung to its body in mangy clumps, but most of it was just pale, hairless skin. It stopped, turning its head, and I saw its face. It was wolf-like, with a long snout, but its ears were torn, and its eyes were small and dark and intelligent. It wasn't a sick animal, it was a broken one, a thing that had been put together incorrectly. It let out a low, soft sound, not a growl, but a pained, wheezing groan, like it was in constant agony. And as it stood there, surveying the small clearing, my body locked up. It wasn't just fear. I'd been scared before. This was different. This was a physical paralysis, a leaden weight that filled my limbs. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even blink. My mind was a silent, screaming passenger in a frozen vessel, forced to do nothing but watch as this nightmare-made flesh took another shambling step.
Time lost all meaning in that root hollow. I was trapped in a staring contest with a creature that shouldn't exist, my 8-year-old mind trying to file it away under a category it didn't have. The thing sniffed the air, its long head twitching from side to side. It took another jerky step, its unnaturally long legs bending with a faint crackling sound. It seemed unaware of my presence, lost in its own world of quiet suffering. Then, for no reason I could discern, it turned and shambled away, disappearing back into the dense woods as silently as it had arrived. The moment it was gone, the paralysis broke. The first breath I took was a ragged, shuddering gasp that felt like swallowing fire. The next thing I knew, my dad's voice was cutting through the woods. "Alex, game's over. Come on out." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just started crying, silent, hot tears streaming down my face. A few minutes later, he pushed aside the ferns. "There you are. You found the best hiding spot of all time." His smile faltered when he saw my face. He pulled me out of the hollow and into his arms. "Hey, what's wrong, champ? Did the forest spirit game scare you a little?" he asked, ruffling my hair. I tried to tell him. I babbled about a sick dog, a wolf with long legs, the wrongness of it. He listened patiently, then knelt down to my level. "Hey," he said softly, "the woods can play tricks on your eyes. It was probably just a coyote, and your imagination ran a little wild. That's okay. It was just a game." He picked me up and carried me back to the clearing, back to the light and the smell of hot dogs, and I let him. Because how do you explain a monster to someone who's just told you monsters aren't real? Years passed. The memory faded, softening at the edges until it felt more like a half-remembered nightmare than a real event. It became that time Alex got scared in the woods. Fast forward 20 years. My parents were downsizing, and I was at their house, helping them clear out the attic. In a dusty box marked Memories, I found a stack of old photo albums. And there it was, summer '99. I sat down on a trunk, a nostalgic smile on my face, and began to flip through the pages. There we were, my mom waving at the camera, my dad with his arm around her, Chloe making a goofy face. There was the picnic blanket, the cooler, the towering pines of Pine Ridge. I turned the page. Another photo, this one of my dad giving me a piggyback ride. We were both laughing. Behind us, deep in the shadows of the tree line, there was a dark, blurry shape. I squinted. A smudge on the lens, probably. I turned the page again, the whole family posing together. The shape was still there, but it was closer now, just at the edge of the clearing. It was no longer a smudge. It was tall. It was thin. It had long limbs. My smile vanished. I flipped the page, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. It was a photo of me holding up a slice of birthday cake. Over my shoulder, Peeking from behind the thick trunk of an oak tree was a patch of pale skin and two small dark eyes. My hands began to shake. I turned to the last photo on the page. It was a close-up my mom had taken of me. I was beaming, holding up a magic wand stick I had found. I looked so proud, and right behind me, perfectly framed over my left shoulder, was the creature. It was out of focus, a soft-edged nightmare in the background, but there was no mistaking it. The gaunt gray head, the mangy fur, the long broken snout. And the worst part, the detail that made a choked sob escape my throat, was the eyes. Those small, dark, intelligent eyes weren't looking at me. They weren't looking at my family. They were staring directly into the camera lens. It wasn't hiding from us. It was posing for the picture.